get in to today's person of interest, I would like all of you to think about a question for a moment. And that question is, what do you think is a scientist? I know that for me, when I think about a scientist, I think of somebody who's spent a lot of time at university, who's spent a lot of time working in a lab, and who's probably gone out and done some field work to take back to their university and study even more. But this concept, which I think a lot of us probably share, is a relatively recent one. It's only in the last several hundred years that the idea of scientists all being trained at universities has been a thing. For the longest time, science and philosophy were considered the same thing, and both of them were taught the same way all of the other trades were taught. Just like a carpenter or a painter, a scientist would apprentice with another scientist and learn the science that they needed to learn to continue their studies. And the reason that we talk about that is because I want to make sure that everybody understands that a scientist is not just a person with a degree and not just a person who is the expert in the field. A scientist is any person who is studying a scientific subject, as long as you are doing so in an objective way, as long as you are doing so with a focus on empirical evidence and a desire to learn, then you are a scientist. And that becomes very relevant for the person that we're going to talk about today, whose name is Jane Goodall. You've probably heard of her. She is one of the most famous primatologists in the world today, and possibly in the world ever. So Jane Goodall was born and raised in England. And when she was very young, she talks about how she would save all of her allowance money and she would go down to this little bookshop near her home and she would buy books and just read and read and read. And almost exclusively fiction, but that is where she first discovered the book Tarzan of the Apes. And it was reading that book that she developed her desire to live with and learn about animals and her particular love for the great apes. Now, she went to school and she grew up, and at the time it was very difficult for women to get into university, especially in England, and especially in scientific fields like primatology or ethology, which is the study of animal behaviors. So Jane started off where she could. She did some work on film sets, helping out the crews. She got a job as a secretary, and she just, did what she could while she could. But when she was 23, on the advice of a friend of hers, she got a hold of the famous British Kenyan archaeologist Louis Leakey. Now, Louis Leakey and his wife, Mary Leakey, who was a very famous paleoanthropologist, were both really focused on studying humans and ancient humans. And they believed that studying the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, would give a better understanding of what kind of behaviors humans' ancestors got up to, because we're so closely related. After Jane spoke to Louis Leakey, she was actually one of 3 young women who were recruited by him and his wife to help them study the great apes. And each of them was assigned one of those groups. So Jane was going to study chimpanzees, a woman named Diana Fossey was going to study gorillas, and a woman named Beirut Galdakas was going to study the orangutans. And both of those women are also experts in their field, and I would highly encourage you to look into their research and their lives, because they are definitely very interesting people as well. So Leakey and his wife sent Jane to study with their friends in England who were experts in the field of primate behavior and primate biology and anatomy. And she spent about a year and a half privately studying with these two experts before she was invited to go to Africa to study these animals for the Leakeys. However, the area where she was going, the Gombe Stream National Park, was administered by a game warden who had very, very particular rules about people coming and going. And he did not feel comfortable with a young woman going into such a dangerous area by himself. So he almost stopped it from happening. But eventually, they managed to negotiate that as long as Jane's mother came with her, then she would be allowed to go. Luckily for Jane, her mother had always been incredibly supportive of what she wanted to do with her life, and her mother had always told her that she needed to try as hard as she could and never let anything get in the way of her achieving her dreams. So her mother was very, very willing to help support her in this endeavor. So in Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, she first met the primates that would become the core of her life's work and would drastically change the way that we understand these animals. And her observations were outstanding because they were so focused. She would sit and just observe the chimps. She stayed in the wilderness with the chimps for an incredibly long period of time. And it was because of this level of closeness that she was able to make some very, very important observations. Firstly, in 1960, after she'd been there for a little while, she realized that the chimps did hunt for meat, which is important to understand because it was previously assumed that chimpanzees were herbivores, that they only ate plants. And so it was Jane Goodall who, through her observations, first provided conclusive evidence that the chimpanzees were omnivores, that they ate both plant matter and meat, and that they also foraged for insects and things. And in foraging for insects, she made an even more vital discovery. She first, in 1962, observed a chimpanzee taking a small stem of tall grass or a small twig and carefully selecting the one that was straight and strong and exactly as it needed it to be, plucking it out of the ground, and then carefully removing all of the leaves and twigs from it before sticking it into the holes in a termite mound and wiggling it around to draw the attention of the soldier termites, and then pulling it out with all of the termites attached to it and eating it. Now, this may not seem like a very big deal at first glance to you or I, but this is an groundbreaking discovery in the field of primate studies. Because what we see here is two incredibly important things. One, we see a primate who is searching for a proper tool that fits certain specifications. They know what they want, they know what it needs to look like, and now they're hunting for the best one. And then after they pull it out of the ground, they pull the twigs and the leaves off of it, which is called object modification. And that is the difference between just swinging a stick and making a tool. And at the time, it was believed that humans were the only species on Earth that used object modification to create tools. Needless to say, this could be an incredibly controversial discovery. When she first informed Louis Leakey about it, his response was, well, either chimps are human or we need to redefine human. And you can imagine that that was a difficult process in and of itself. But also, Jane had no degree. She had no university education. And what's more, and this might be surprising to a lot of you, but the by far the most controversial thing about her research was that she named all of the chimpanzees that she worked with. At the time, it was common practice to give research animals or animals that you were observing in the wild numbers, because it was thought that giving them names would create kind of a sentimental attachment that would prevent you from having an objective analysis of the situation. So, between the fact that she gave them names, and the fact that she was a young woman, and in the fact that she had no formal university education, many people were very quick to dismiss her claims. But there was plenty of corroborating evidence. National Geographic quickly sent photographers and filmmakers out who recorded this behavior on multiple occasions, and Jane's research was proven very quickly to be very correct. Now, later on, she would, through her acquaintance with Louis Leakey, gain the opportunity to go to Cambridge and study primatology and ethology, where she would get a PhD. And she is one of only 8 people in the history of that university to get her doctorate without previously having had another degree, which is quite amazing. But what's much more amazing is what she's done since then. You see, Jane Goodall spent more than 12 years with her family in the in Tanganyika, in the Gombe Stream National Park. And while she was there, I mean, not just living with her family and raising her children, she was also continuing to study primates. There are families of chimpanzees there that Jane Goodall has studied where she knows the great grandparents of the chimpanzee family, and she has been around and she has personally studied those families as the grandparents, parents, and children of that family have been born and have been raised. And that kind of generational knowledge provides an amazing insight into the way they behave. And it is because of this sort of generational familiarity that Jane Goodall was able to really conclusively show that these great apes have feelings and emotions and family connections, and that they have a sense of humor and lots of other things that we thought were exclusively the province of humankind. And since then, Jane has been a ceaseless advocate for conservation of chimps in specific, but also just conservation in general. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute for Research, which continues to research chimpanzees to this day. She's founded many chimp rehabilitation centers in areas where chimps are hunted for what's called bushmeat in the bushmeat trade. She founded the Tanganyika Reforestation and Education Project, where she helps educate local youth on the values of conservation, as well as working to replant a lot of the deforested areas around Lake Tanganyika. And to this day, Jane Goodall, who is alive and well at the age of 86 right now, travels the world 300 days a year to support conservation efforts all over the world and to give lectures and to teach. She has a main focus in several different programs that she's founded, like the Roots, Shoots, and Grubs program and other programs, where she works with children between the ages of 10 and 15 and helps them learn about conservation and how to plant trees and how to observe animals and all of these things, because Jane Goodall believes that the core of helping us become better stewards of our environment is in helping the youth of today learn how to do that. And not just how to do that, but why that is important. Now, I'm really happy that this is the one we decided to end on, because this will likely be the last one of these that I'm going to be able to make for you guys. But it really, I think, sums up something that we've been focusing on a lot with our previous conversations. And I don't want to undermine the other lessons that have come along. With Margaret Collins, we learned that it's important to stand up and do what you think should be done. And with Claire Patterson, we learned that sometimes you have to push through opposition in order to discover scientific truth. But with Robin Kimmerer and John Muir and now Jane Goodall, we've learned that the most important thing in helping us protect and preserve our environment for future generations is to fundamentally change the way that we think about our environment. And that comes with sharing and teaching these important and invaluable lessons about conservation, respect for nature, and the importance of those things. So I hope to be able to talk to you again, but until I can, I hope that you continue learning about nature, continue spending time in nature, and most importantly, continue telling people about nature. Thank you.